Hello and welcome back to the endocrine system. This video is part 2 of 3. In looking further at the endocrine system, we're going to take a look first at the hypothalamus-pituitary complex. You'll recall from studying the nervous system that the hypothalamus is a collection of nuclei, that's gray matter, that's largely involved in regulating homeostasis. And so when we look at the hypothalamus, we see that there are actually neurons that project from the hypothalamus into the posterior pituitary. And there are also ways that the hypothalamus has to direct the activities of the anterior pituitary. Remember, the pituitary gland is that gland that sits in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. So often when we have stimulus that is received by the nervous system and it has to pass through that hypothalamus-pituitary complex to be translated into hormones that can initiate a specific response. So that's how it helps to coordinate the endocrine and nervous system together, acting as that command system of the endocrine system. And when this occurs, the hormones that are produced are either going to directly affect target organs, or they might regulate the production and secretion of hormones from other glands within the endocrine system. This is just another view of the pituitary gland. As you can see in the picture at the bottom left-hand side, it's a close-up view. You can see the hypothalamus. You can see inferior to the hypothalamus, we have the optic chiasma anteriorly, a mammillary body posteriorly, and then there's a direct connection of the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland by way of the infundibulum. And the pituitary gland itself is going to consist of two parts. We've got anteriorly the adenohypophysis, which is the anterior pituitary, and posteriorly we have the neurohypophysis, which is basically going to contain axons of neurons and axon terminals of neurons that originated in the hypothalamus. And that's where it got its name, neurohypophysis. The posterior portion of the pituitary gland, or posterior pituitary or neurohypophysis, is only made up of neural tissue. So it doesn't produce hormones, but rather it stores and secretes hormones that are produced by neurons in specific nuclei of the hypothalamus. If you take a close look at this picture, you'll see that the soma or cell bodies of those neurons reside either in the paraventricular nuclei, which are responsible for producing both antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, as well as the supraoptic nuclei, which only produce antidiuretic hormone. Those hormones are going to be transported down the axons into the axon terminals, where they will reside in secretory vesicles until they're stimulated to be released into the bloodstream. And in this picture, you can also see the inferior hypophyseal artery, which forms a little capillary bed. So when those hormones are released, they will diffuse into the bloodstream, and then the bloodstream will carry them all over the body. Oxytocin released from the posterior pituitary is often referred to as the tend and befriend hormone because it's a very bonding hormone. It's what's released by the posterior pituitary when an infant is nursing. It causes the smooth muscle myoepithelial cells around the mammary glands to contract, so milk is actually ejected during breastfeeding. It also causes smooth muscle to contract during labor, so the stretch of the cervix sends signals to the hypothalamus, which causes the release of oxytocin, and that causes the smooth muscle contraction. Oxytocin is also released during an orgasm, and that's how people can sometimes become bonded to the wrong individual if they have sex too early on in a relationship. Next, we're going to take a look at antidiuretic hormone. The term antidiuretic literally means against diuresis, don't pee, because there may be a situation where the body needs to conserve fluid. And in the hypothalamus, there are special chemoreceptors known as osmoreceptors, which constantly monitor the osmolarity in our bloodstream. If there is less fluid, water in the blood, that means there's going to be a higher ratio of solute to fluid, or higher osmolarity. When higher osmolarity is detected by these osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, it stimulates a thirst response, and it also causes the neurons in the hypothalamus to secrete the antidiuretic hormone in the ends of the axons in the posterior pituitary, so that antidiuretic hormone circulates through the body and the bloodstream. Antidiuretic hormone has an effect on the distal convoluted tubules and collecting ducts in the kidneys that causes them to resorb water so that it doesn't leave the body as urine. If you look in the picture on the right, you'll notice that there's another mechanism that occurs. I'm going to try and take my picture out. Hopefully I'm off your screen. If we look at the picture on the right, you'll notice that if blood pressure or volume decreases, there are special pressure receptors, baroreceptors, in an area of the kidneys, and you'll see this at the bottom right of the screen, where we have collections of cells known as the juxtaglomerular apparatus. A decrease in blood pressure, which if we decrease volume, we decrease pressure, is going to stimulate those cells to release a hormone known as renin into the bloodstream. When renin is released into the bloodstream, it converts a protein known as angiotensinogen that's made by the liver into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is converted into angiotensin 2 in the lungs, and angiotensin 2 causes arterioles, which are tiny blood vessels. They're not the smallest. Capillaries are the smallest. It will cause arterioles to constrict. Remember, when blood vessels constrict, that's going to increase blood pressure. And it also causes the adrenal gland to secrete aldosterone, and aldosterone is going to act on those distal convoluted tubules in the kidneys to cause them to resorb water, so that when we have more fluid volume in the bloodstream, that's going to increase blood pressure. So if we have a decrease in blood pressure, we kick in the renin-angiotensin system, and that helps to increase blood volume, which increases blood pressure. If you can't remember how that works, just think of a hose. If you turn the hose all the way on, you've got more volume, more pressure. If you decrease the amount of fluid going through a hose, it's less volume, less pressure. You'll notice in this particular slide that both of these mechanisms are negative feedback, which is the most common way we have for regulation of systems in the body. And you'll also notice that this response of increasing blood pressure can be caused by pain, because pain would be part of something that would trigger the sympathetic nervous system. And remember, the sympathetic nervous system is that fight or flight response where we have blood vessel constriction, which would increase blood pressure. What happens if a person's not producing enough antidiuretic hormone? That can lead to a condition known as diabetes insipidus, where a person experiences a lot of thirst and is going to the bathroom quite a lot. It can be caused by different things, including trauma to the head or infection. It can also have a nephrogenic cause where the tubules are not responding to the antidiuretic hormone. We know that when people consume alcohol, that inhibits the release of antidiuretic hormone. And again, a person will be urinating more often, experience dehydration, and a hangover is actually the result of that dehydrated state a person experiences after consuming alcohol. Sometimes the opposite can occur where we see hypersecretion of antidiuretic hormone. This can occur in kids who may have experienced meningitis or adults who may have had brain surgery or cancer because the cancer cells tend to overproduce antidiuretic hormone. Before we get into the anterior pituitary or adenohypophysis, I wanted to bring you back to that concept of the communication between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. If you look at the upper right-hand side of this picture, you'll see the neurons we discussed that are going to have axons that go all the way to the posterior portion of the pituitary gland or neurohypophysis, where antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin are stored and secreted. When we look at the upper left side where you see the indirect control of the release of regulatory hormones, this is where we have the hypothalamus communicating with the anterior portion of the pituitary gland or the adenohypophysis. And you'll notice that the hypothalamus has neurons that produce two types of hormones, releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. Releasing hormones are going to cause other cells to release hormones, and inhibiting hormones prevent that release. So let's take a quick look at the hormones produced by the hypothalamus that are going to communicate with the adenohypophysis. And this includes corticotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropic releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, prolactin releasing factor, prolactin inhibiting hormone, and gonadotropin releasing hormone. All of those hormones are hormones produced by the hypothalamus that are going to communicate with the anterior pituitary, also known as the adenohypophysis. Since the axons of the neurons in the hypothalamus that make those hormones don't go into the anterior pituitary directly, we're going to take a look at the actual mechanism that's used to accomplish that. We're going to orient ourselves with this picture first, and I just want you to pay attention to the neurons in green that have axons that go all the way down into the posterior pituitary. You'll also notice in the hypothalamus there are neurons that appear to be more purple in color, and the axons of those neurons don't go to the anterior pituitary because instead those neurons produce either releasing or inhibiting hormones that are going to be secreted into capillary beds where they are picked up by special portal vessels that go to the anterior pituitary or adenohypophysis. The anterior pituitary is made up of glandular tissue that produces and stores hormones, and you'll notice in looking at this picture that there are special endocrine cells that release their hormones into a second set of capillaries to be distributed throughout the rest of the body. So The hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary include tropic hormones and non-tropic hormones. Tropic means acting upon, and tropic hormones, including follicle-stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, luteinizing hormone, and thyroid-stimulating hormones, are named so because they will stimulate other endocrine glands to produce hormones. Whereas non-tropic hormones like prolactin and growth hormone do not stimulate other glands to produce hormones. That's the difference between the two. Here's another slide about tropic hormones. They have a stimulating effect on other glands, and basically thyroid stimulating hormone or thyrotropin is going to control the production and release of thyroid hormones. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete some of its hormones. Remember, a lot of organs, including glands, often have an outer cortex and an inner medullary portion. We see this with the adrenal gland. There's the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. When we get to the urinary system, there's a cortical portion or cortex of a kidney, and then there's an inner medullary portion. So I think in terms of chocolate, think of an M&M. There's an outer candy coating shell, that's the cortex, and then the inner chocolate part is the medulla. This takes us to follicle stimulating hormone, which helps to stimulate the development of follicles in the ovaries, which produce and secrete estrogens, and in males it stimulates the development of the seminiferous tubules in the testes to maintain the production of sperm. Luteinizing hormone helps to stimulate follicle cells in ovaries to mature, and it also stimulates ovulation, which is the release of the ovum, and it stimulates a special area of the ovary that has released the egg, known as the corpus luteum, to secrete the hormones estrogen and progesterone. And it also has an effect in males that it causes special cells known as interstitial cells in the testes to produce and secrete testosterone. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are referred to as gonadotropins because they stimulate the growth and maintenance of the gonads, which are sex organs, testes and ovaries. The anterior pituitary, as I mentioned before, also will produce and release growth hormone and prolactin, but those are not considered to be tropic hormones because they don't stimulate other glands to make hormones the way the tropic hormones do. So the tropic hormones are turning on the next gland to make its hormones, whereas growth hormone and prolactin do not do that. I really like this chart because it demonstrates the hypothalamic control of the adenohypophysis. If we look at the top where you see the term hypothalamus, and then underneath it, it goes through the hypophyseal portal system, that's that capillary network, and the portal vessels, which take hormones from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and then from the anterior pituitary it's released into the bloodstream where it will circulate to target glands and tissues. Let's start at the top left of this chart, and you can see gonadotropic releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which then flows through the bloodstream to affect the gonads, causing the production and secretion of estrogen and testosterone and progesterone, depending on the circumstances of what's going on in the body in females. Next we have growth hormone releasing hormone, which again, after going to the anterior pituitary, promotes the secretion of growth hormone in the bloodstream, which is going to affect how we metabolize different chemical reactions in our body and promotes the growth of tissues. Somatostatin, which is also known as growth hormone inhibiting hormone, actually inhibits the release of growth hormone and inhibits the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. If we look at thyroid releasing hormone in the hypothalamus, you'll see that it is going to stimulate the release of thyroid stimulating hormone in the adenohypophysis, which when it goes through the circulation will stimulate the thyroid gland to produce and secrete its hormones, thyronine and triiodothyronine. So those will be secreted. And then we have prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is going to inhibit the release of prolactin from the anterior pituitary gland. And we also have prolactin releasing hormone, which will stimulate the release of prolactin. When prolactin is released into the bloodstream, it will reach eventually the target glands and tissues in the breast, which causes the production of breast tissue and milk production. And then we have on the far right, corticotropic releasing hormone, which is going to stimulate the adenohypophysis to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to produce and secrete cortisol, which will be released into the bloodstream. Next, we're going to take a look at the effects of growth hormone. Growth hormone is also known as somatotropin. This hormone is anabolic, which means it's going to cause chemical reactions to occur that help build things up. And this helps to regulate growth by building proteins and tissues. If we look at this picture at the top left, you'll see the release of growth hormone, which would be stimulated by the hypothalamus releasing growth hormone releasing hormone. That stimulates the adenohypophysis or anterior pituitary gland to release growth hormone. Growth hormone has three specific effects. One is called a glucose-sparing effect, where it actually stimulates adipocytes to break down stored fat so that can be used as energy for metabolism. The second effect of growth hormone is a growth effect, where there is actually an increase in the movement of amino acids into cells from the bloodstream to enhance the production of building proteins. And we also see more mitosis, so there's more tissue growth with more cellular growth and more growth occurring actually inside of cells because we're building more proteins inside the cells. And we see that bone cells, muscle cells, neurons, and cells in our immune system are all going to be affected by this effect of growth. And then the third effect of growth hormone is known as a diabetogenic effect, where the growth hormone stimulates cells in the liver to break glycogen down into glucose, allowing glucose to be used as energy to fuel the other chemical reactions that are occurring in the target cells, in the bone cells, the muscle cells, neurons, and immune cells. Now, the liver also releases insulin-like growth factor 1, which further stimulates and enhances the growth effects on those target cells. At the same time, when the liver releases insulin-like growth factor 1, that acts to go back to the hypothalamus. And when the hypothalamus perceives higher levels of insulin-like growth factor 1, it actually causes the hypothalamus to produce growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which would then be released to the anterior pituitary to stop the continuous release of growth hormone. And that's the negative feedback loop. When we have growth hormone releasing hormone, that starts the cycle of releasing growth hormone, but we don't want it continuously released. And it's that insulin-like growth factor 1 that turns off the release of growth factor from the anterior pituitary. And by the way, I mentioned before that somatotropin is another name for growth hormone. Remember that somatostatin is the other term for growth hormone inhibiting hormone. To recap, growth hormone has indirect actions where through the release of insulin-like growth factors from the liver, growth hormone helps promote building, anabolism of bone, muscle, and nervous tissue and immune cells. However, directly what's going to occur with growth hormone is we're going to see this catabolism of fat. So we're breaking down fat to break it down where we can use fat and break it into its smaller components to have more glucose available for energy, because glucose in the presence of oxygen in the mitochondria is where we're going to get the production of adenosine triphosphate to use for these chemical reactions to build up muscle and fat and to make proteins. So growth hormone is sometimes referred to as an insulin antagonist, because as our cells are going to be using glucose for anabolism to build stuff up, growth hormone helps break down fat to maintain blood glucose levels so they don't drop too low, and that's why it's referred to as an insulin antagonist. Normally, insulin pulls sugar out of the bloodstream, but growth hormone helps to maintain glucose levels so they don't drop too low. You may remember from ANP1 that if there is too much growth hormone in the body before growth plates close, that can cause a condition known as gigantism. And if there's not enough growth hormone in the body, that can lead to a condition known as pituitary dwarfism. And after growth plates close, if a person starts taking growth hormone and has it in excess, that can lead to a condition known as acromegaly, where we see excessive growth, specifically in the mandible of adults, the hands, and the feet. Normally, people who do bodybuilding or who are, sometimes you'll see this in sports like boxing, it's common in bodybuilders, they'll start taking growth hormone to help build their muscle, and there's side effects of that where they develop acromegaly. Another hormone that is produced by the endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary is thyroid stimulating hormone, also known as thyrotropin. And this again is going to be released in response to thyrotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. If it's a releasing or inhibitory hormone, it's coming from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. And thyroid stimulating hormone is going to do just that. It's going to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce thyrine and triiodothyronine, T4 and T3, respectively. And those hormones are going, when they're released from the thyroid gland, are going to circulate back to the hypothalamus and to the anterior pituitary in a negative feedback mechanism to regulate the thyroid releasing hormone that's coming from the hypothalamus. So again, thyroid stimulating hormone is produced by the thyroid gland in response to thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. The thyroid gland is going to produce its hormones. We'll take a look at those in a little bit. Right now we're just focusing on the adenohypophysis. Another hormone produced by the anterior pituitary is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as corticotropin, is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete what are known as corticosteroid hormones. If we look from the top down, you'll notice that the hypothalamus at the top of this picture is, in response to stress, going to release corticotropic releasing hormone, also known as adrenocorticotropic releasing hormone, because that's the central regulator of something known as the hypothalamic-pituitary adrenal, or HPA axis, which is the main regulator of our response to stress. And under stress, the hypothalamus releasing a releasing hormone known as corticotropic releasing hormone, that is going to go to the anterior pituitary by way of the special capillary beds and portal vessels that take those hormones to the anterior pituitary. From there, the anterior pituitary releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is going to affect the cells in the adrenal cortex, and it causes those to release glucocorticoids. Under chronic stress over time, this is going to lead to things like hypertension, obesity, diabetes, anxiety. It can also suppress reproductive functions. And remember that stress doesn't just affect the adrenal cortex. Remember, from the sympathetic fight-flight response, it's going to stimulate the medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. So this body ends up becoming in this chronic stress fight-flight response that causes a lot of metabolic problems along the way. So again, that's one of those responses due to adrenocorticotropic hormone. As we keep going through these hormones, I really want you to get it in your head that the hypothalamus is going to be responsible for either producing and secreting releasing or inhibiting hormones. So whenever you think of what the hypothalamus does, release or inhibit, then it's going to go to anterior pituitary, since we're not talking about the neurohypophysis right now. So just that anterior portion, we start hypothalamus, release, inhibit. Pituitary gland is going to be the tropic hormones or non-tropic with growth hormone and prolactin. The tropic hormones are going to turn on another gland. So in this case, turning on the adrenal cortex, and that's going to produce and release glucocorticoids from that portion of that gland. This takes us to follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, otherwise collectively known as gonadotropins, because these hormones affect the gonads. These hormones are going to be released by the anterior pituitary in response to gonadotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone are going to regulate the function of the gonads, either ovaries in females or testes in the male, and they regulate the development of gender-specific characteristics in males and females, where females will be producing estrogen and progesterone and males will be producing testosterone. And these hormones, once they are produced and released by the gonads, are going to circulate through the bloodstream and help to turn off the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary by way of negative feedback mechanisms. There is a mnemonic that's kind of fun for follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. If you think of FSH or FISH, stimulates spermatogenesis. That's the creation of sperm in males. So sperm look like fish because they've got the little tails. And we know that luteinizing hormone in males stimulates the secretion of androgens, testosterone. So males become like hairy apes, okay? LH, like hairy, okay? And then in females, luteinizing hormones stimulates the maturity of ovarian follicles where eggs are produced. It triggers ovulation and hormone synthesis. So if you think of fish and hairy, like hairy in males, that might help you remember that. There is another portion of the pituitary gland that's between the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. It's called the intermediate pituitary. This is where we have cells that produce a hormone known as melanocyte stimulating hormone, and it's actually formed by cutting a molecule known as pro-opiomelanocortin. It's a precursor protein, and it's secreted by cells in that area between the pituitary lobes. And local production of melanocyte stimulating hormone does occur in the skin, and it helps cells produce melanin in response to ultraviolet waves. The pituitary gland is more complicated because it can induce the production of melanin by melanocytes, and women show an increased production of melanocyte stimulating hormone when they're pregnant in combination with estrogens. It leads to a darker pigmentation of the skin around the areola, which is the area that surrounds the nipple, and so the skin of the areola, the labia minora, and there's an area that goes from the xiphoid process down towards the pubic tubercles called the linea alba. It's connective tissue that will darken during pregnancy. It goes from the linea alba and it turns into what's known as the linea nigra. So it turns from a white line that's not really visible into a darker line that's visible during pregnancy. Pro-opiomelanocortin also plays a role in immune function. It helps to direct the production of white blood cells for immune function. And if a person has to take corticosteroids, they actually inhibit the production of pro-opiomelanocortin, and that's why people who are on corticosteroids are more susceptible to infection. Here we have a chart, a summary of the hormones that are produced by the neurons that have axons that go to the posterior pituitary or neurohypophysis, and some of the effects of those hormones, as well as with the neurons that secrete hormones, releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus that go to the adenohypophysis or anterior pituitary gland. And you can see that some of them are releasing hormones, some of them are inhibiting hormones, and then you can see the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary, their target, and some of their effects. I really like this particular picture because it really shows the capillary system where the neurons from the hypothalamus are going to secrete hormones that are going to be picked up by these tiny little capillaries and then go through the hypophyseal portal veins to the adenohypophysis. And here you can also see the superior hypophyseal artery and the inferior hypophyseal artery on the left-hand side and the lower right-hand side respectively, as they bring blood supply to these capillary beds and then carry hormones away to target tissues in the body respectively. Next, we're going to take a look at the thyroid gland, which is made up of two lobes. There's a right lobe and a left lobe that are connected in the center by an isthmus. And these lobes have parathyroid glands embedded on their posterior surface. The thyroid gland is made up of tissue that is comprised of follicles. Remember, a follicle is just a space where something is created, and the follicles contain colloid, and the follicles are surrounded by epithelial follicle cells. They're simple cuboidal epithelium, and these epithelial follicle cells are going to be further surrounded by what are called parafollicular or C cells, which basically live in the connective tissue around the follicles. And colloid is a substance that contains a protein known as thyroglobulin, which is a precursor protein for thyroxine and triiodothyronine, T4 and T3 respectively. Next, we're going to take a look at how thyroid stimulating hormone helps the thyroid gland produce its hormones. Normally, the follicular cells, which surround the follicles in the thyroid gland, produce a protein called thyroglobulin. This thyroglobulin has a lot of the amino acid tyrosine, and the thyroglobulin, as it is produced, gets transported into the follicle, into the colloid. In the presence of thyroid stimulating hormone, the receptors on the follicular cells are able to trap iodide, and as iodide is trapped into the follicular cells, it will be transported through while undergoing a process of oxidation where it loses some electrons and some hydrogen and gains oxygen, and iodine is released into the colloid with the thyroglobulin that has its amino acids tyrosine. The iodine will bind to the tyrosine on the thyroglobulin, creating two different molecules. It creates diiodotyrosine and monoiodotyrosine, and those bind together to form thyroxine and triiodothyronine on the thyroglobulin, which will then be exported out of the colloid and transported through the follicular cells, where enzymes will cleave the triiodothyronine and thyroxine from the thyroglobulin, and the triiodothyronine and thyroxine will diffuse into the bloodstream. The production of hormones from the thyroid gland is going to be regulated by negative feedback, as are most systems in the body. And if the hypothalamus detects low levels of thyroxine and triiodothyronine in the bloodstream, that will cause the hypothalamus to produce and secrete thyroid releasing hormone, which goes to the anterior pituitary to cause the release of thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, which will stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more triiodothyronine and thyroxine, and that will cause an increase in metabolism in cells, an increase in body temperature, and as the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary detect an increase in levels of triiodothyronine and thyroxine, that will inhibit the release of thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, as well as it will inhibit the release of thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. When we look at thyroid hormone function, well, what do these hormones do? Triiodothyronine and thyroxine are going to be strong influencers in terms of our basal metabolic rate by acting on mitochondria. And why the mitochondria? Well, the mitochondria are responsible for producing adenosine triphosphate, which is important for protein synthesis, for not only the development of tissues, but also for our neurological function. Remember that a lot of neurotransmitters are going to be amino-based or polypeptides or protein-based, and so a lot of tissue development, neurological function, reproductive hormone interaction, immune cell interaction, this is directly going to regulate functional aspects in terms of activation, differentiation, cell proliferation for mitosis, migration of molecules through using proteins as tracks for moving things through cells. There's so many activities that are based on adenosine triphosphate. Even the sodium-potassium pump, we need to have enough adenosine triphosphate for metabolism to occur, for growth to occur, for development to occur. And so we see also that these hormones are going to increase sensitivity to molecules that are known as catecholamines, like epinephrine and norepinephrine. And we find that in looking at these hormones, triiodothyronine is more powerful. It has stronger effects than thyroxine, but thyroxine is often converted into triiodothyronine in the bloodstream. So lots of effects for thyroid hormone. If there is an iodine deficiency, that can result in the thyroid stimulating hormone being produced more in the effort to produce enough thyroxine and triiodothyronine. And this is what leads to an accumulation of thyroglobulin and colloid, causing that swollen appearance of the thyroid gland, which is what we refer to as a goiter. But because there's a deficiency in iodine, if people don't get enough iodine in their diet, then that can cause impaired growth. It can lead to decreased fertility. It can lead to mental retardation. In neonatal hypothyroidism, we see cretinism, which is this not only delayed growth, but also delayed and deficient neurological development. So we can have cognitive deficits, deafness, muteness, when mothers are deficient in iodine when they're pregnant. So not only will we have a shorter stature with these individuals, but it affects their neurological development as well. Adults may sometimes develop hypothyroidism, not from an iodine deficiency, but usually from an autoimmune problem where the body starts attacking the thyroid gland. causing it to become inflamed, and then as it becomes inflamed, it's unable to produce the hormones it would normally produce. And normally these people present with a low metabolic rate, weight gain. They'll often complain of feeling cold in their extremities, being constipated, not having a normal sex drive, and they'll also have a reduced mental activity. In people with hyperthyroidism, that is often occurred by either a pituitary tumor or a thyroid tumor, the patient will present with elevated thyroid hormone levels in their bloodstream, and this is often called Graves' disease, where it's an autoimmune problem where antibodies actually mimic thyroid stimulating hormone, causing an overproduction of thyroid hormones, and that again causes an increase in metabolic rate, excessive body heat. Usually the patient will have swelling, diarrhea, will have a decrease in weight, so they see weight loss. Sometimes they'll be shaking, have an elevated heart rate, exophthalmos, where the eyes are bulging, and occasionally a goiter might be present with this. The thyroid gland also produces calcitonin, and this is a hormone produced by the parafollicular or C cells. And this hormone is going to be released in response to increased levels of calcium in the bloodstream. And it plays a small role in calcium homeostasis, and its importance isn't really well understood, but it is believed to help promote the deposition of calcium into bones. It's also believed to inhibit osteoclasts and stimulate osteoblasts. And as you remember, osteoclasts break bone down, osteoblasts build bone. So again, it's also believed to help deposit calcium into bone. It's also thought to inhibit the calcium reabsorption in the kidney. So it also is thought to inhibit calcium absorption in the intestine. So again, the roles of calcitonin are not well known, but if there's too much or higher levels of calcium in the bloodstream than normal, it helps to get rid of that excess calcium by excreting it in the urine, inhibiting it being absorbed in the intestines, and promoting the deposition of calcium into bone. So for a summary of the thyroid gland, we've got this last slide showing you the chemical class of hormones. Thyroxine, triiodothyronine are both amines, and their basic effect is to stimulate basal metabolic rate, the chemical reactions that occur in the body 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as well as the production of calcitonin, which is a peptide hormone which reduces blood levels of calcium.